Welcome to the Jefferson Auditorium. We're looking forward to today's lecture. The sponsors for the Morris Hansen lecture are the Washington Statistical Society, WestStat, and USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service. So we have behind the screen the president of WSS, who's making sure that things are recorded. We have, is it a vice president, Jerry? President, whoa, stand right on up. and president-elect of ASA at the end of the year, right? At the end of the year. And we have the administrator who's new to us this year, Joe Parsons for NAS. Now, you had to go through security, so you figure there's rules. So one of the things is if you need to go to the restroom, you go out, you turn right at the hall, and it'll be on your right, okay? Don't go left, okay? They'll stop you. Also, the Whitten patio is where we'll have the reception, and there'll be people lined along the way so you won't get lost. You won't lose yourself, get lost. And so you go out, you turn right again, and you'll get directions to where we're going. We hope everyone will join us for that. I think it'll be a really nice time. Now, one last thing, and I have to wait till I sit down to do it. Take out your telephones, your cell phones, and make sure they're muted. All right? And with that, I'll turn it over to this year's chair of the Morris Hansen Committee, Carolina Franco, sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see such a great turnout here. And I wanted to first thank you all for coming here. I know how hard it is to find time for this in-person event. And yet the fact that we're all here is kind of proof of the importance of such in-person events and of coming together as a statistical community to kind of discuss the challenges we face. So this year we're privileged to have Dr. Connie Citro, who's a very distinguished senior scholar with the Committee on National Statistics at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Her extensive work, particularly her leadership on the measurement of income and poverty, provides invaluable insights into some of the most pressing challenges we face in official statistics today. And her talk is particularly timely and relevant. Income and poverty statistics are central to understanding the well-being of individuals and informing policies that address inequality and economic hardship. These measures shape decisions that affect many people's lives. But as Dr. Citro will explore, capturing accurate data on income and poverty is quite difficult. And after her keynote, we'll have some really interesting discussions from Marina Gindelsky from BEA and Jonathan Rothbaum from Census. And I'd like to first, on behalf of the whole program committee, I'd like to thank the speakers for what I know will be a really fascinating event. And some more thanks are needed because we need to keep in mind that these events are only possible because of the efforts of many volunteers who are doing this in addition to their very busy full-time jobs and family schedules, etc. So I'd like to profusely thank Darcy Miller from NAS, who graciously took over the daunting task of organizing the event after the person who used to organize it left, and the person had been organizing for many, many years. And Darcy did a fantastic job on her very first time. So thank you so much, Darcy. In fact, yes, I was gonna ask for a round of applause. I also owe a really big thanks to the rest of the program committee. You saw them all helping me out before the ceremony. This was really a team effort. Every member of the program committee contributed to the event greatly. And I couldn't have done it without it. We couldn't have done it without it. So thank you so much. So this year, We had Linda Young as NAS representative, Jerry Morrow as Westside representative, Bill Bell, Jonathan Auerbach, and Jenny Thompson as rotating members. And I wanted to especially thank Jenny for being the past chair. She has to kind of make sure I don't screw up too much as current chair. And also Linda has been involved with this for so many years, and she's key to this whole thing. So I also like to thank her. So perhaps we can now give a round of applause. And if you could stand up, the people in the program committee, a round of applause for them too. And last but not least, I want to acknowledge the Washington Statistical Society, who also are crucial to making this event happen. So for instance, Jonathan Auerbach, who's right now in the back helping make the AV work, graciously not only accepted to be in our committee, but also he's the WSS president. So, and he served as liaison as well. And there were many other people involved like Daifeng Han and Eliana Moore and Maura Bardos. So, and many more. So some of them I know are not here. Are any, and he's back there, Jonathan is back there. Is anyone here? And we'll give, well, let's just give him a round of applause. So another thing to know about is that these lectures get published in peer-reviewed journals, and the papers are really interesting. Last year, we had one by Jiming Zhang. It was on model selections in surveys, and it was recently published in JSSAM along with a discussion by Andrea Culescu. So I encourage to check that out, and also the previous ones were really interested as well. So that being said, now we're gonna start with the program. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the speakers first. I'm gonna read you their bios. So I hope you enjoy the program. So let me tell you about Connie. So Dr. Constance F. Citro, known by many as Connie Citro, is a senior scholar with the Committee of National Statistics, or CenStat. She previously was CenStat's director from 2004 to 2017, and senior study director from 1986 to 2003. Prior to joining CenStat in 1984, she held positions as vice president of Mathematica Policy Research, Inc., and Data Use and Access Laboratories, Inc. Her first job in Washington, D.C. was as a social science analyst with the US Census Bureau in the late 60s, where she actually met Maurice Hansen. Citro was an ASF, NSF Census Bureau Research Fellow, and is a fellow of the ASA and an elected member of the ISI. She served as president of the Association of Public Data Users and as its representative to the Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics. She edited the Window on Washington column for Chance Magazine and served on the advisory committee of the Journal of Survey Statistics and Methodology. For CenStat, she directed evaluations of numerous federal censuses and surveys with a focus on methodology for the decennial census and the measurement of poverty, income, and program participation. She served on the ASA Task Force on 2020 Census Quality Indicators and is a member of its project team to assess the health of the federal statistical system. She received the Roger Herriot Award for Innovation in Federal Statistics in 1997 and the Waksberg Award in Survey Methodology in 2014. And in 2018, the ASA established the Links Lecture Award in honor of Citro, Robert Groves, and Fritz Schuren. So very impressive background. And I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the discussants. Dr. Marina Gindelsky is a research economist at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, Office of the Chief Economist. Her current research focuses on income distributions, including the recently launched Distribution of Personal Income, which distributes US macro national account totals to households, and participation in the OECD expert group on disparities in a national accounts framework. She is currently working on nowcasting inequality and constructing a distribution of personal saving. She has a wide range of research interests and publications in labor, urban and development economics, and a diverse set of ongoing projects, including forecasting and measuring multidimensional inequality, analyzing historical urban growth in developing countries, assessing immigrant assimilation outcomes, and estimating housing using silo data. Next, about Dr. Jonathan Rothbaum, who's a research economist in the Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics Division at the US Census Bureau. He's a labor economist researching the use of administrative data in the estimation of income, resource, and well-being statistics, particularly focused on measurement error, non-response, and imputation. He is the lead researcher on the National Experimental Wellbeing Statistics Project, which uses extensive survey, decennial, administrative, and commercial data to improve estimates of income and poverty. He also researches equality of opportunity and intergenerational mobility. So now I'd like to invite Connie to the stage, and before she gives her presentation, I'd like to present her with a plaque to commemorate this event. Connie.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now, here is this wonderful gizmo that I understand is supposed to advance my slides. Okay. It is an honor to be here to give the 30-second Morris Hansen lecture. And I'm so appreciative to all of you for coming out. Thank you so very much. My topic is challenges in measuring household income and poverty. Why is it so hard and why is it so important? This graph, courtesy of David Johnson, is a really apt illustration. These are all lines of percentage change since 1979 in various measures of mean and median household income. They're all going in the same direction, which is good, namely up, but the differences in the rate of increase are just incredibly dramatic. So when public and policymakers look at these, what are we to make of these? We care whether income was really growing faster or slower, and why all these differences? Well, there we go, great. My talk, where I hope to shed light on this matter, some light, draws on my work at Census and elsewhere on income and poverty statistics and surveys. But the views are my own, developed over some period of time, and so don't attribute them to Census or the academies. Okay, I'm going to be telling a 100-year story beginning at the turn of the 20th century about the why and how of household and family income and poverty statistics in the US. I'll be making a connection to Morris Hansen. He cared deeply about data quality, cost effectiveness, and evidence. I'm going to be showing that quality problems in survey-based income statistics have been present from the get-go, as have efforts to understand and remedy them. And there's been a search, in fact, for the robust income survey. Now, these efforts in this search have been uneven, and I have concluded ultimately unavailing. But I will be ending on a positive note with kudos for recent work at BEA, BLS, the Census Bureau, and the Fed on using blended data for improved statistics. This work needs resources, priority, readier access to administrative and other data, but it's really exciting. And throughout the story, I'm going to be name dropping various people who made a difference And I apologize if your favorite person in this area is not here. I couldn't get everything or everybody in. But I wanted to show that individuals can make a difference even in very tough times. I want to give credit to Sally Keller for the term statistical product first, which essentially charges statistical agencies to determine what public and policymakers need in terms of relevant, accurate, et cetera, statistics in a particular area and work backwards to the best sources. Okay, measures of economic well-being are just among the most central statistics. Every government in the world has statistical agencies collecting a variety of measures. They could be income, consumption, wealth, poverty, insecurity, you name it. And many countries use consumption as their primary measure. The US really started with income, current income that represents potential consumption. This resonates with the public, and it's long been viewed as an effective policy tool and lever. Now, all of these concepts of economic well-being pose challenging definitional, measurement, estimation issues. Is it the household, the family, equivalized, you name it, what inflation measure, et cetera, et cetera. The question here has been the search for more relevant, accurate, and coherent measures. Spoiler alert, I won't be picking one of these things in David's graph. There is no one single measure that answers all purposes. And I won't be going into great detail on any or all of these measures. I'm doing a broad story of the search for more useful, robust macro and micro household income statistics, culminating in a blended data approach. All right, I've been throwing around measures of data quality, right? And we've come a long way in the field from sampling variability and even total survey error. Broad quality frameworks now have been around for a while. The Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology issued one in 2020. Its dimensions are on the side there. My focus, relevance, accessibility, wherein I include transparency, accuracy, and coherence. And I'm going to assume for a moment that everything else is okay. Now, quality cannot be the only consideration. It has to be viewed in conjunction with costs and response burden, the concept of cost effectiveness. Okay, I said I was starting my story at the turn of the 20th century, but I can't just ignore our whole previous history. Statistics are in our DNA. There's the census in the Constitution and the Treasury Department. Alexander Hamilton, right up from the get-go, kept detailed trade statistics because tariffs and excise taxes were the principal sources of federal revenue. And actually, we didn't seem to need, and we couldn't have readily got income data when relatively few people were wage earners as we know that today. From the 1820 census, most people were in agriculture, were in NAS, 14% in manufacturing, and a few in commerce. Okay, the Civil War really marked a demarcation here. Massive population changes began and continued. Urbanization, industrialization, immigration. And as part of that, labor unions formed. And one of the things they did after a 20-year campaign, they finally got the BLS established to illuminate the state of economic affairs for urban wage workers. Okay, also in this period, there were a number of sharp, sudden, some long-term economic downturns. No Fed to help, no social safety net. So people were really asking, what about income adequacy? Okay, NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, actually led the way on distributional household income statistics. There were these disputes. Was labor getting a fair share? Or Corporate greed, this was the Gilded Age of robber barons, had undercut labor in favor of capital. Others blamed immigration for suppressing wages, and others denied that there was any problem, that there hadn't been any major increase in income inequality. And economists, I'm actually a political scientist by training, but as is their wont, economists were hurling critiques at each other and different estimates. So after World War I, some guys got some funding, a couple of these robber barons foundations to establish a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization. And its very first report was on the distribution of income in the United States, well, its amount and its distribution. And they said in their preface, yeah, we wanted to know whether income was adequate, growing adequately, more or less unequal. And then I love this language, sift the divergencies among the various estimates out there. NBER estimated a very broad concept called national income that includes everything. It's not much used in distributional analysis these days, but no matter. They used aggregate data from a variety of sources, greatly helped by the fact that the 1913 income tax law generated data from people's tax returns. And if you read about it, they had a staff in one room or set of rooms working on estimating national income from the product side and another staff from the income side. And then they had some kind of great reveal to see how close they were. And they were actually pretty close. Then they took the next step, which was crucial from my point of view. They distributed this income to people receiving income that they put in various buckets. The chapter on this is wonderful. There are inequality curves and tables galore and very careful discussion of the data. Now, why did this really matter to have these distributions? Well, here's just one finding, that prior to World War I, the top 5% of income receivers were getting a third of that national income. Following World War I, it had dropped to only a quarter. Well, this line of work of aggregate data, macro statistics, but distributions to households continued at NBER and with the Department of Commerce to develop the national income and product accounts. All right. Surveys, census as a source of income by asking people. Well, you couldn't do surveys until you had sampling and everything established at the federal government level, which happened in the 1930s. Now, you can't read the top, this very messy thing at the top of the slide, but is a picture of the last page of a booklet that census enumerators would carry with them, and they'd be checking on the columns. And at the very end of the last page were two questions: your wages, dollar amount up to $5,000 or more, and whether or not you had any non-wage income of more than $50. Those are circled in red. They were at the end so that if people objected, they would have already answered the rest of the census. And in fact, there were those in Congress who did object on privacy grounds, but that was overcome and the response rate was great. And income questions continued in the census on the long form and now on the ACS. Well, but a 10-year census didn't cut it, right? So here is the current population survey, having been recently established monthly collection of unemployment. In May 1945, the first income supplement, 7 sources of regular money income were asked. Now, money income excludes non-cash income. And I could only find one sentence in the earliest report that hinted at why. It referred to inherent difficulties. Well, but the problem is that there was a lot of in-kind income even then. There was no food stamps or Medicare, but lots of people, farmers and others, were growing their own or collecting their own fuel through their cutting wood. NBER and the NIPAs included that, but the census didn't. Also, when tax credits came along, they could not be counted either because they were not regular money income. This was actually an unfortunate consequential decision, this constraint on this definition. All right, what's the connection to Morris Hansen? Well, he came on the scene at the Census Bureau in 1935, and he put probability sampling, as we all know, on the map, overcoming a lot of bureaucratic resistance in doing so. Hansen, Hurwitz, and Maddow, the textbook. But he did so much more. He moved heaven and earth to get the first non-defense computer into the Census Bureau for the 1950 census at the tail end. And there's a picture of UNIVAC 1 there, which is now in the Smithsonian. And what this permitted, among other things, was hot deck imputation in the 60 census and then in surveys. And this was a big deal. It used to be that statistical agencies, they'd tabulate printed tables and books, and there'd be lines that said, oh, so many people didn't answer. And those numbers would differ across tables. So you'd have this hodgepodge from the user's point of view. Well, hot deck imputation filled that all in, nearest neighbor, et cetera. Great innovation. And there is an urban legend about the meaning of the term hot deck. And if you're interested, ask me at some point. Okay, now Morris also put research and development on the map at the Census Bureau. He really cared about data quality. He wanted evidence. And the classic example, which we actually documented in one of our reports on the census, was the shift from enumerators to self-response in the census. Census Bureau was worried about costs and availability of workforce. Morris was really worried about the variance that came from the enumerators. And there were studies that showed, for instance, that the 1950 census was no better than a 25% sample because of this variance. And so they shifted carefully, but pretty thoroughly to maximizing self-response. And I wanted to give a shout out here to Art Kennicol, who in his work at the Fed with the Survey of Consumer Finances has always emphasized a focus on the role of enumerators in getting good data. All right, well, the Commerce Department, Office of Business Economics, Bureau of Economic Analysis, putting together macro estimates and distributing them to households continued. They had a concept of personal income, a bit narrower than national income, but broader than the regular money income. So they distributed, first of all, they constructed family personal income, threw out a couple things like nonprofit income that really didn't apply to families, and then produced family money income to be comparable, and they had to make adjustments both plus and minus. They were using tabular data heavily from the IRS, and I have a picture here of a Monroe calculator. This is what I imagine these machines were clacking away to produce these tables. Okay. They did a very careful study comparing the BEA family money income to the CPS regular money income. Selma Goldsmith at OBE has a wonderful chapter in an NBER report. And the bottom line is the CPS was doing okay in some components, but falling short. Wages are pretty good, up in the 90%, comparably. Non-farm self-employment got better, Social Security, but farm self-employment and property income and public assistance were really falling short. And it's not, by the way, that the administrative benchmarks were perfect. They weren't, but they were better based on a whole lot of analysis than what the CPS was able to obtain. All right, we move from the Monroe calculator to the computer, and we also move to what I call a golden age for federal statistics, certainly in income and poverty. in the 60s and the 70s. There was an exploding demand and an ability to provide data on family income and poverty. The war on poverty needed data. Molly Orshansky at Social Security, using spending data, came up with her poverty thresholds. The comparison of what resources the family had to determine whether you're poor or not, again, relied on the regular money income. Meanwhile, benefit programs were blossoming. The country spent a lot of money here. Food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, housing vouchers, the EITC. And most of these wouldn't count in that regular money income. Computers made possible the policy analysis to develop these programs. There were microdata, PUMS files, and microsimulation models. And the last couple of estimates that BEA produced for distributions for households were done not with the Monroe calculator, but with microdata, computers, exact and statistical matching. Okay, I'm going to be coming back to this chart. It's about various indicators that I've normalized of economic growth. The blue line, the one that's moving up big time, is BEA disposable personal income per capita, an average. The purple line, ignore the red line for a minute. I'll come back to it later. The purple line is men's median earnings, which are pretty well reported in the CPS. In the 60s and 70s, where the green oval is, these were moving in tandem. We were having huge economic growth that was lifting many boats. And this made possible the programs I've mentioned and the investment in social science research and data and models. And just a word on the models. They take microdata, program rules, behavioral response, spit out costs, participants, gainers, and losers. I was at Mathematica then, which had one of these models, and I wasn't one of the modelers, but I remember them walking around pretty stressed when they would be getting constant requests. Well, let's tweak a little bit as we try to shape legislation. Congress finally decided they want their own modeler and estimator, and they set up CBO during this period. And as part of it was the search for better income data, because the CPS, of course, always the income part had to take second place to the monthly unemployment data. And it had all these problems, you know, no in-kind benefits, no assets, no part-year data, et cetera, et cetera. There were a couple of big standalone surveys in this period, but the big thing was the Income Survey Development Program, launched as a consortium of the Policy Shop and HHS, Social Security, and the Census Bureau. And this was to lead to SIP, the Survey of Income and Program Participation. Whether you can read it or not, take a look. There was a huge amount of data collected for the ISDP, huge amount of work and experiments and controls and so on and so on. And staff analysis from in-house, and there were 4 research centers. And Mathematica had one of those, and I was part of that, and John Chaika, when he joined Mathematica, was too. Also during this period, this golden age, Congress is saying, well, look, we're spending billions, literally, Medicare, food stamps, you name it. We'd really like it to be in the measures. So finally, the 80 CPS adds questions on non-cash benefits. And the Census Bureau builds a tax model. And Tim Smeating gets his PhD dissertation out of his work at the Census Bureau, technical paper number 50, Alternative Methods of Valuing In-Kind Benefits and the Effects on Poverty. Because the problem with in-kind benefits is you can't just assume that there's a one-for-one equivalence with cash. And the treatment of healthcare benefits is particularly makes a difference. It's very easy to make older people, people with disabilities, look rich because depending on how you treat the healthcare benefits. All right, we then come to what I call a lost decade for statistics, certainly in income and poverty. There was an election, Ronald Reagan won. They had no interest in social science research, data modeling, you name it. The ISDP analysis was just cut off at the knees, and SIP was supposed to be moved to Social Security when it became operational, to be owned by Social Security with Census doing the collection, just like other surveys like the Health Interview Survey, it's an NCHS survey that Census does. Devastating budget cuts. Agencies, whole agencies, ASPE, the Social Security Research Office, just cut off. And no chief statistician. It was really, really bad. I was at Mathematica then, and I can tell you that it was really bad. All right, SIP actually was rescued. And there's a story behind that. Ask me if you are interested. But it had a rocky start. It started, and it was rescued at the Census Bureau. It started with interviews in fall of '83 with the design that had been carefully worked out. We want part-year data, and we want some couple of years data. So a panel was chosen, 4-month interviews for over a period of like 8 or 9 waves, monthly rotation groups so that the field work was, at a level effort continuously. But one design feature that was planned but had never been really had the tires kicked was a new panel would start every year so you could combine the data across panels for robust cross-sectional estimates. Well, that meant that 2 or 3 panels were in the field at the same time. The data were pouring in. It overwhelmed the Census Bureau's processing ability. They gamely put out some reports, quarterly economic data for households, but those didn't last very long. Everything fell behind, files, tables, documentation, you name it. But SIP nonetheless developed a committed user base because it provided data on part-year participation, assets, multi-year participation, jobs, et cetera, that no other survey did. Okay, what about data quality? The idea had been that SIP would be the income survey and the CPS income supplement might actually go away. Well, initially SIP was better. It had more complete reporting, less item non-response. It had other problems, like people did not accurately report when they went off jobs or programs. They would anchor it to the beginning or end of an interview wave. It was better, but it wasn't all that much better. And here there are comparisons. Again, you probably can't read them unless you're really up close, but SIP is in the purple. And wages. CPS is doing a better job at getting wages than SIP. And that's been true from the get-go. Other income sources, SIP was doing pretty well, maybe better, but property income and self-employment, just problematic, and other sources, not that great either. Response rates, though, were good. Now, this is the golden age of response rates, right, folks, that we would all give our arm and a leg to get back to. This is from about 1980-ish up to about 2010, 2012. The top line is the main CPS. The green line is the income supplement. The pink line is SIP at wave 1. The purple line is a SIP panel at wave 6. And those SIP things are trending down. But really, this was the golden age, and that was not a big problem anywhere. Falls off the chart there later on. Okay, the people at the Census Bureau and the users of SIP said, can't we do better? Cannot we do better? So as part of their work, there is a really nifty report on the who and the why of missing income data by Census Bureau staff, income measurement error and surveys. 1997. They compared did these kinds of comparisons I've been showing across various surveys and types of income and types of people, and there are just these shortfalls and other problems. And most dismaying, the cognitive literature suggested that there were a bunch of factors at work here. People might not report an income source because they didn't realize that another member of the household had it, or they might have forgotten about something, or their definition, their concept of what was being asked about for a particular source was not what actually was intended. And then I love this term, sensitivity. There were some folks for some income sources who were not going to tell you about those sources no matter what. So the authors concluded that it's really taxing to ask people about income, and no single source can really, if you tackle that, you haven't solved the problem. But that did not deter them from some experiments in the 90s to improve the SIP income data. They first did a big record check, 4 states with a bunch of administrative data, and just matched the heck out of it and looked at the over and under reports and the seam problem and so on and so on. Then they did a really nifty cognitive research evaluation experiment, they called it. The idea was to see whether if you got respondents to consult their records, could you do better? So they were going to interview for 2 waves, draw their sample from administrative records so that they could match, and they redesigned question wording, the training for the interviewers, you name it, to emphasize getting records. Okay, well, what happened? They did get people to use records. The experimental group, even in the wave 1, was 75% almost using records, and up to 85% in wave 2. The control group was just at a quarter, but sample loss in the experimental group by wave 2 was 3 times that of the controls, and the cost per case was 2 to 3 times. So they had to conclude that this was not cost effective for a survey that was supposed to be in the field continuously and big sample and so on. Factors were the experimental interviews took longer, people consulting records, more visits to get an interview and then to complete an interview. Well, what about quality? Well, the records help greatly if you told people that you had a source or were on a program. They did not help if you did not report it in the first place. They did not encourage you to report it, and imputation couldn't help. Now, these 2 graphs, the top are controls, the bottom is experimentals, and look at them, they look similar, the same, essentially. The blue lines for 4 programs are how many people said they did not participate in this program. They underreported, or that they just underreported months. They might have been on 6 months, but they reported 4, or maybe they reported 0. The orange is the percentage of the blue people who reported 0, didn't tell you about it. And that's most of the underreporting. All right. We had the 80s of these terrible budget cuts. Well, slowly things got back where resources were not quite so constrained. In addition to this work on SIP, there were a number of initiatives that were important. 2 actually came from Congress. They said, for Title I fund allocation to school districts with disadvantaged children, we want annual estimates. We don't want to continue to rely on the every decade census. So the Census Bureau had its SAPI program, small area income and poverty estimates. We were tasked to do a study of it, and Bill Bell worked on that. And this is a nifty program. It's using, hierarchical Bayes, administrative data, survey data, blended data approach, but it produces a relatively small set of estimates. Congress also said, we've been hearing the poverty measure, the official one, has this regular money income base. And what about, non-cash benefits and everything? So the Academy, CenStat, was commissioned to do a study and recommend, which we did. And BLS and Census got to work kicking the tires, producing experimental estimates. The Census Bureau did a couple of things, one of which they concluded, I think rightly, that SIP in fact could not do everything, and they tried to simplify its design. They also worked on the American Community Survey, which I don't have time, but if I did, was another huge innovation of continuous small area data replacing the long form of the census, which had been declining in quality. And for every congressperson who complains about the ACS, you can bet that their constituents and their staff are using it. All right, back to this chart about economic growth. Remember in the 60s, men's median earnings are going up along with aggregate average, per capita disposable personal income. The disposable income, the blue top line, is going gangbusters throughout. The dip is COVID. The purple line has gone flat in the early 70s, basically flat. The red line is a Fed statistics, again, normalized here, of the percent that mortgage and credit card debt is of disposable personal income. And that's gone up and down, but leading to the years that I'm going to be focusing on here, which is the lead up to the Great Recession, that was rising. Do you remember people were being told everybody should be a homeowner? And people were being then sold teaser mortgage rates because, in fact, many people did not have the income or the assets to support a regular mortgage. So they'd get a teaser rate and it was going to kick in, and they would support their spending from their housing equity. But the financial people, to their everlasting shame, were slicing and dicing these rather ill-supported mortgages and selling those slices and dices and pretending that somehow the repackaging was turning these into sound investments, which they were not. And when the housing market started to soften, the whole thing crashed in the Great Recession. So there we are with the Great Recession. And the thing is, nobody saw it coming. I actually looked into this. There were a handful of economists who predicted that we were, a year or two ahead of time, that we were aiming for a bust, and they were poo-pooed. And my question is why? And I call it ships passing in the night. The macro people were looking at that blue line going up just fine, and the micro people somehow were not putting together that many households really didn't have income, let alone assets, once the house value cratered. And we can see this in what data people could look at. The administrative records-based series, BEA, personal income. Well, they had added a lot of value to it over the years. There were estimates for states and regions and so on, but they had stopped doing any of those distributional estimates. The last one was for 1972. There was a nifty BLS, Employment Cost Index, the ECI, which is the change in the hourly rate of labor costs, wages plus benefits for employers. This is a great index for what it's designed to do. But people were using it in the business press to say, hey, wage workers seem to be not so badly off, and everything seems to be okay. Well, the ECI was rising, but not wages very much. It was the cost of health insurance to employers, which was not putting any money into anybody's pockets for mortgages or anything else. On the survey side, there were a plethora of data, but nothing that really gave a full picture. The CPS income data had all these problems we've talked about. SIP was losing ground on quality and timely data release. And in fact, the Census Bureau put it on the chopping block in 2006, said, well, we have a budget cut, let's get rid of it. Well, it was rescued and redesigned again. The survey of consumer finance that the Fed does is actually a really nifty asset, debt, and income survey. It does quite a quality job, but it has a small sample, about 6,000 households, every 3 years, and it costs a heck of a lot per case. So it is not a substitute with those characteristics for surveys, that produce annual data with big samples. The ACS was just underway and it has limited income data. SAPI, again, limited estimates, doing well at what it's doing. And BLS began adding value to the income data in the consumer expenditure survey. But anyway, there just wasn't any one source to give a coherent picture. Similarly, estimates. Following up on Tim's meeting, the Census Bureau produced a whole bunch of alternative household income estimates. What if you count capital gains? What if you count food stamps? They were up to 18 definitions. Well, this is useful for people who want to study the importance of various components, but what were policymakers supposed to pick out of that? Similarly, the Census Bureau was kicking the tires of the Academy's recommendations on poverty with a whole bunch of experimental estimates. And there was no one with the will or to sort of say, what would be some preferred estimates to help policy and the public? In their defense, what resources did the agencies have? Well, that arrow ends at 2008. In the period 2000 to 2008, agencies, this is BEA, BLS, and the survey part of Census, have declining or flat budgets in real terms. All right, after the crash, I am now in my upbeat side of we are genuinely entering an era of great progress in my mind toward more relevant, accurate, coherent income and poverty statistics for households, families, rich and poor, et cetera. So, number of developments, and they all seem to just come out of a whole bunch of agencies. Supplemental poverty measure. Becky Blank had the brilliant idea, if we can't derail the official measure because it's locked into statistical policy directive and programs, we'll end run around it. This measure, while not perfect, does count non-cash benefits and tax credits and so on, and it is a better measure than the official measure. And this is evident in this graph. Since the SPM started in 2011, for much of its history to date, it tracks pretty well. It's the blue top line with the official measure. Then we get to COVID. The bottom falls out. The government throws money at it, mostly through the tax system, like the child tax credit expansion. Poverty goes significantly down in the SPM, stays flat in the OPM because it can't count those programs. And then when those programs expire, goes up again. This is just huge. And the most recent report of Censtat on the poverty measure says the SPM should be the principal poverty measure for analysis and the media and everybody. All right, BEA decides to get back into the household personal income game, okay? And I'm not sure, I'd like to know more about the reasons, but Dennis Fixler and David Johnson do some work. Congress pushes for this, but it's really coming out of the agency. And finally, in March 2020, Marina Gindelsky, whom you'll be hearing from, the lead staff person, they release distributional household personal income estimates, deciles, a whole bunch of inequality measures, and so on. Now, this again is personal income. It's not money income, and it shouldn't be money income, but it's different. And they have been adding to that, expanding the availability, the bells and whistles. Now, one thing that still bugs me is to find this on the BEA website, you have to know where to look. It is under special topics. That's where it started, and that's where it still is. All right. CBO, same time, began producing pretty regular household income distributional reports. And they use tax records matched to the CPS, and they do correct various sources for underreporting. And the Fed in 2019 starts to blend the Survey of Consumer Finance with their aggregate financial wealth data. There are now quarterly estimates of household wealth. And BLS and BEA, household distributions are consumer economic unit distributions, consumer unit distributions for consumption expenditures, savings, just really, really important data. All right, the Census Bureau finally starts to develop improved household income data from the CPS. Bruce Meyer professor at University of Chicago, has done a lot of great work on the problems of underreporting, which have gotten worse over time in all the major surveys of various sources of income. And he has, he works in an FSRDC and so on. He has foundation funding, and he's building the comprehensive income data set, which is linking surveys to a whole bunch of administrative records, not just the CPS, but other surveys. And he's published a lot of really insightful research. Adam B. and Jonathan Rothbaum, and he's our other discussant, put out a seminal paper in 2019 about the possibilities for using administrative and commercial data to beef up the income statistics from the CPS. I can't leave without a couple of historical notes. Roger Harriet and John Coder had this idea back in 1988 to combine SIP, CPS income, and administrative records. But at that time, the technical, operational, legal barriers were just too great. And then David Johnson, when SIP was put on the chopping block, said, how about we take the CPS administrative records and do some follow-on surveys to get the dynamics of economic well-being system. Well, SIP was rescued. The SIP users wanted the SIP they knew and loved. And we don't have dues, but we do have news. National Economic Well-Being Statistics, first released by Jonathan and his colleagues, 2023 for 2018. This is still regular money income, but they've improved the weights, the imputation, combined or replaced survey data with administrative records, use multiple data sources, models, just like a recent Censtat report on the 21st century infrastructure talked about. Why it matters. Median household income in their estimates, 6% higher than the official. For older people, 27% higher, because the CPS is not doing a great job with older people's income and from retirement and assets and so on and so on. Okay, where do we go next? Well, again, I want to first of all say these are big deals. I also want to compliment the staff at Statistics of Income at IRS because they've been improving, expanding the available tax return series, which underlie a lot of this work. But there's a long way to go to make all of these series relevant, timely. I think news probably has the heaviest lift to move from research and production to generate high quality before and after, tax and transfer, including in-kind benefits and so on. But also these series, like that original graph I started with, are not coherent. They differ in some ways that are necessary and important in some concepts and so on, but they differ in a whole number of other ways. Your inflation measure, your household equivalence measure, or whether you use one, your tabulation categories. There's a chapter in a recent Census report that calls for an integrated system of household income, consumption, and wealth statistics, which lays out the differences in the existing series. And I think it will curl your hair. There are differences in, deciles, quintiles, you use, say, income categories or in other characteristics, just because agencies have been doing their own thing. And so things have just gone the way they have in separate agencies. And it's fine to have, there are some differences that are important, but others really could be made more coherent. And a report that we did on transparency in federal statistics, I encourage your reading. Okay, what do these initiatives need? Priority from the agency, the department, and OMB. These are bedrock series. They need to be statistical product first. And coherence. This integration report that I referenced recommends an interagency working group to just thrash out and resolve inconsistencies that don't make sense and just confuse things for users. And then write a report that explains the remaining important differences. This would not cost very much to do. PEA could help by, in addition to doing what it's doing with its own concepts, to do a series that is whatever the CPS is doing. It is not just in-kind benefits or tax credits. There are differences in how retirement income is dealt with and other things. Similarly, once news is operational, microsimulation models, CBO et al. Should not have to do their own adjustments, which differ at times. What else do these agencies need? Do these initiatives need? Well, they need resources. And the problem, of course, is I showed you flat resources leading up to the Great Recession. There was a boost because it became evident that a lot of data series needed bolstering, that Congress had been penny wise and pound foolish. But after that, we're now on a declining or flat. So there needs to be a coordinated education of Congress and readier access to federal state administrative records. And this report with the yellow cover from the American Statistical Association, the nation's data at risk, talks about resources. In fact, the data I have here are from that report, and talks about how about amending the Evidence Act to really overcome some of the barriers that remain on data sharing. And I commend that report to you if you haven't seen it. All right, summing up, in the year 2024, the 100-year-plus journey has had ups and downs, but throughout, efforts to improve household distributions of income and poverty, inequality measures, you name it, because these measures are essential for policy and public understanding. Aggregates on the economy alone, we need them, but alone, they don't cut it. Even at low points, individuals have made a difference, some of them ahead of their time. The solution in this case has necessitated a blended data approach and complementary efforts across several statistical agencies. Now, they need agency, OMB priority, resources, and elimination of barriers to data sharing, particularly among the statistical agencies. There are undoubtedly stories like this in other areas, education, employment, long stories of key series. I encourage all of you who work in other areas, find out your story and push your agency to give priority to important series and to adopt statistical product first to work back to the data sources that you need to get accurate and relevant and transparent and useful data. Okay, my last slide. Okay, it has been a labor of love to prepare this lecture. I want to thank the agencies who have scanned a lot of historical materials without which I could not have done this. They're on their websites. And Senstat reports, which among other things, often have, almost always have, a lot of historical background that you don't find anywhere that they brought together. And my thanks to the Hansen Lecture Committee and NAS and the Discussants and all of you who work in the area of income and poverty statistics for the public good. And also my plaudits to all statistical agency staff. You face huge headwinds these days, you know, declining, falling off the cliff response rates and scant resources and barriers to doing a number of things. But you're out there and you're doing your level best to serve users, policymakers, the public. You stand on the shoulders of giants, and you already are, or you will be, giants for the next generation. Morris Hansen would be the first to thank you and support you and cheer you on. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Connie, for a great talk. I'd like to invite Marina now to come to the audience. Where's Marina? Okay, there you go.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Connie. I found that to be really interesting, and I actually learned a lot of new information. And my hair is already a little curly, so mission accomplished. I thought it was super interesting. So I'm going to focus on the two questions from the title slides. Why is it hard and why is it important? And since I'm representing BEA here, although my views are my own and not those of BEA, I'm going to focus on the income side of this question. So the key challenges here are first, data availability and quality, and then determining the right measure, and I put that in quotes because there's a lot of disagreement on that, of income consumption or wealth. The third is coordination among statistical agencies. And the fourth is creating consistently long time series. And I will go through these in turn, but especially the fourth is something that not a lot of attention is paid to because it's not enough to develop a really good measure. You need to have the resources and methodological consistency in order to actually create a time series which can be plotted in some of those things that we're seeing in order to be useful for data users and for policymakers. So first, this data availability and quality question. So BEA, BLS, and Census all produce annual inequality measures using their data sources. So with BEA, that's aggregated data, and then BLS and Census have the microdata. They produce some sub-annual data as well. But the current lag that we have with the microdata is from the CPS on the income side, and that is about 10 months because the CPS is administered when people are doing their tax returns to get the most accurate income information. It takes time to collect and process the information, and so Census puts it out in the fall. And that is the most comprehensive survey that we currently have on income sources. We have some state estimates with the ACS from Census and then some from BEA at the aggregated level as well to complement that. And all the agencies maintain a really high level of integrity. Everybody working on these accounts has a really high level of quality that they're aiming for, and they look at very detailed questions when it comes to data consistency and definitions. They don't let anything slide. The people like Thesa Garner look so carefully at every question to make sure that what is being measured is actually the right thing when you look at the data question. Those things are invaluable because when the questions aren't worded well, where the data isn't collected well, the resulting analysis we do will also be of poor quality. So it's through the efforts of people like that that we actually get to the high quality statistics that our agencies produce. So what's missing from this broad quality framework are conversations about exactly this: measurement error, assumptions, and replicability. So the BEA measurement objectives for our income distribution series are to produce measures that are valid, informative, and transparent. Because there has been such a surge of work in income inequality in the last 15 years, there have been significant conversations both among government statisticians and in the academic community regarding which assumptions are being made in order to produce an inequality series, especially as it pertains to distributional national accounts. When there are 80 components of income to estimate, each assumption is going to make a difference in the final product. Some assumptions make very little difference. They might move the Gini coefficient by, say, 0.0001. Others make a big difference. They could move a Gini coefficient by 0.06 based on the estimation of the calculation of one variable alone. So we try to make as few assumptions as possible, and that is why we distribute personal income, which is the closest to households. So it does include transfers, it includes labor income, it includes interest and dividends as well. It does not include capital gains. It does not include retirement disbursements, and it does not include things like defense spending. So there are things that national income includes like that, which can be $3 or $4 trillion. And there is almost no way to distribute them to households in a way that makes sense. Your choices are either by after tax income or before tax income, or else equally, or something in between. Which of those you pick has a really significant impact on the distributional result. So we're doing personal income, which does not include that big total, which is very significant. So the source data for the BEA estimate comes from many different places. We have the CPS ASEC, which is the foundation of our estimate. We supplement it with published SOI data from IRS, as well as data from the ACS, the CE, and even some healthcare data from CMS and from MEPS. All of these data sources come with a lag. Our smallest lag is the CPS 10 months. Our biggest lag is the IRS 2 years. And all of those form the foundations of our estimate, which is why our core estimate is published 2 years after the reference period, and a provisional one is published 1 year after the reference period. So we break personal income into many components, and then we allocate each component in the macro total according to a variable in the micro total as granularly as possible. So wages are allocated to those reporting wages, self-employment to those reporting self-employment, and so on with transfers. The kind of transfers that are in personal income include things like both SNAP and WIC, but also Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. And so you can see from this picture that those transfers are actually really large, and they play a significant role in the measure of personal income. We calculate personal income for each household such that it scales to the national total, and then we equivalize by dividing by the square root of household size so as to be able to compare household sizes to each other. So is this the right measure of income? There's a technical problem where you have to quantify the distribution and the differences between households. And then there's the conceptual question of going beyond GDP. So since we're BEA and we put out GDP, the first question for BEA was which national accounts total is best? And here we went with personal income for the reasons I described. The question is what we're learning from doing these income distributions. And if you think about how growth is allocated to households and you agree that in order to actually answer the question of how macroeconomic growth is tied to micro households, you need a national accounts measure consistent with national accounts definitions in order to be able to answer that question. But there's significant disagreements even once you've said, okay, I need a national accounts measure, among which one. So we've gone with personal income, but the fact that it doesn't include capital gains and it doesn't include retirement income is going to give you fundamentally different answers than measures like the CBO produces, which includes both. It will, however, scale to national accounts. So if we come back to our objectives, I'd argue that transfers are the most important thing to consider when we're looking at a national accounts measure because they play such a significant difference in how we look at the patterns of inequality and the levels over the last few decades. Capital gains and retirement disbursements, I would argue, are also very important. And if I were to consider a non-national accounts measure for inequality research, I would focus on one that includes both retirement and capital gains. So I plotted a few lines here just to be able to compare the impact of these things. And the blue is the PI, the light blue is disposable personal income. The orange is if we had a census-like adjusted money income measure, and the other orange is the before tax and transfers. And on the right, you have the share of transfers in PI. So clearly, transfers play a huge role in personal income, and they are increasing. So it's especially important that they are measured well in the CPS and that we are distributing them since they're increasingly important to both our economy and to measuring inequality. But overall, regardless of which one of those you choose, the levels and trends are the same because they include the transfers. If you look at the composition across the distribution, the first decile being the 0 to 10%, you see that most of the income is coming from those transfers when it comes to personal income. Conversely, for the 10th decile, most of the income is coming from labor, so wages, self-employment, and then a significant share is coming from capital here, which I defined as interest and dividends. The trends over time also look very similar, regardless of the measure you choose. They are all relatively flat. The Gini is relatively flat for this 2020 period, and so is the top 20% share. So these measures, which do include transfers, do not have the runaway graphs that you typically see in news coverage. So the most important thing when it comes to producing these accounts is that BEA can't produce these accounts alone. When we talk about products of statistical agencies, it's important to note that even when the collaboration isn't officially, mentioned and highlighted, we are working together. We have access to the microdata provided to Census by the IRS in order to produce those 1-year lagged estimates as opposed to 2-year lags. That's very important. It helps data users by reducing our lag by a whole year. We had to develop methodology to be able to utilize that in order to advance our accounts. We've been working very closely with BLS for the past few years to do that joint distribution of income and consumption, which led to distribution of saving, which is a brand new product. And we do have significant challenges still, both in working with BLS and with Census, in order to do disclosure. So some of the things that we would like to do, we wouldn't necessarily be able to do with disclosure, but we do the best we can, and we work together to get the most accurate estimates possible. I think it would be optimal if we could produce a single set of consistent measures across agencies, and this would be something like you would start with sort of commonly agreed upon sources of income, labor and capital, and then you would add transfers and subtract taxes, and you would be able to get some consistent thing. Now, I don't know how much this is possible, but I think it would be optimal if we could pool resources to do something like this. But a lot of these decisions are not made at the agency levels, they're made at the department level. And so when we talk about resources and what we can do, we think about how to create a consistent time series with all this in mind, with the departments working together, which would then allow the agencies to pool their resources and working together. So ours doesn't go back to 67 because of all of the different components of personal income. A lot of them are not available before 2000 or before the early 90s. And we need a lot of modeling to be able to expand that series backwards if we're going to do so. That also comes from resources because modeling is expensive. It's expensive in terms of getting qualified people to do all this modeling. It's expensive in terms of getting data to be able to supplement the fact that you don't have the right data sources that you have going forward. So why is it important to do this at all? So there's agreement that we should go beyond GDP, but then there's a question of how these data are produced. We know that census data series are typically cited in a lot of media, as well as in many academic papers in the economics literature. They are, in my opinion, the gold standard that we have right now for what inequality series should look like. They're comprehensive, they're consistent, they are subject to structural breaks as they are revised and improved. We know that BLS is kind of the gold standard for consumption data. BEA is combining these things to look at national accounts as another dimension of answering these questions. But the question that I have is, who is actually using the BEA series and for what purpose? So if any of you are finding them useful, please come and let me know how so, and we can hopefully make a case for them. So what do we do with the limited resources? We have increasing survey non-response. We have the increased desire for timeliness, which has never been so pressing in light of the pandemic. We've seen that people want to know the answer yesterday. They don't want to know the answer 2 years from now. Well, if we want to know the answer as soon as possible, we need increased access to data. It's actually becoming more restrictive. We have increased disclosure requirements, increased noise infusion. We have disagreements between agencies. It's kind of like fighting for scraps of funding that remains. Agencies want to be able to attract staff by saying, hi, we have this data, not give that data out to everyone. And so we end up with this kind of race to the bottom in terms of access in order to produce these accounts. So what we've done at BEA is, other than these collaborations with BLS, we're also working with the Fed to add wealth to our accounts in some way. We're working on a possible cash measure, which would address some of these questions on what is right and allow some connection between cash and national accounts concepts. And then we're working on nowcasting to be able to produce these more timely without such a heavy reliance on micro data. It would serve as an advanced estimate. So it would not replace our complex microdata calculations, but it would provide an answer to the overall inequality a little bit sooner. And that's all. Thank you.
So next we have Dr. Jonathan Rothbaum. Oh.
So I'm going to talk about work that we're doing at the Census Bureau to try to address these challenges. And I want to start with why we think this is so important and sort of build on what Connie said. One of the challenges we see is surveys are getting harder to field. So if you look at our main income survey, where the official poverty measure comes from, non-response has basically tripled in the last 10 years, from 10% to 30%. If you look at, for those units, so the 70% of units that still respond, almost half of the dollars that are coming from those units are imputed. So a lot of people don't like answering the income questions. If you think of where the dollar is coming from, it's 55% of 70%. And then if you look at those people who do give us an answer, they often underreport. And the big challenge here is the way they underreport is generally they just say no. And so this was mentioned before, about 45% of households that have retirement income say no, and this includes both pensions and withdrawals from 401ks. If you look at program benefits, almost 40 to 45% of households that have food stamp SNAP benefits say no, I don't. And so we're going to be missing a lot of money. And if you look at just for money income, this is what Connie showed some statistics from. If you look at our estimates from news against the official estimates, we see a lot more money at the bottom of the distribution, about 10% at the 25th percentile, about 6% at the median, and about 3% at the 75th percentile. And if you go to the top, we also see a lot more money because of the top coding in the surveys. So this is a lot of money that we're missing, and we have, say, 10% about of people who are not poor according to our news estimates, but because of underreporting and some of the challenges of collecting the data, are classified as poor in the surveys. So now I want to take a step back and say, what are we trying to do with the news project? And it's very much, we started this with this approach before the statistical products first, but it's very much in that vein, which is if we want to estimate poverty, what is the best estimate we could possibly get at the Census Bureau with all the data that we have at our disposal? And I think generally that wouldn't be just use the CPS ASEC responses or one survey's responses and ignore everything else we might know. We really need to bring everything together. And there's been a ton of work on how surveys may fall short in terms of data accuracy. And we want to put all that work together in one place because it can often be the case that you could correct for one source of bias and get an estimate that is further from the truth than if you had corrected for all of them, that you're actually, the biases may not all be in the same direction. And so that's what we're trying to do. We pull together data from the surveys, the decennial censuses, administrative records, commercial, so third-party data. And one of the things that we found that's very important is it's often really necessary to link them at the person level to address the underreporting. So it's one thing to know that we're missing almost half of retirement income or almost half of interest and dividends. It's another thing to know whose income that is, because if it's all Bill Gates's dividends from Microsoft, then it affects inequality, but it doesn't really affect poverty. But if it's people who report no retirement income who are classified as poor, but actually have a pension that's $40,000 and they're not, then it's going to affect poverty and inequality and our household income distributions. One of the goals we have is to do everything in as transparent and replicable a manner as possible. There are tons of decisions that go into this kind of work that have huge impacts that are really in the weeds. So if you followed sort of Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman's papers, or the sort of rebuttals by Otten and Splinter at Treasury, they get very, very different stories with basically the same input data about what's happened to inequality over the last 50 years that all hinge on these assumptions like who should we impute this missing self-employment income to that doesn't get reported on tax returns that we know exists from audit data, or what happened to reporting versus true income across major tax law changes like in the 80s. And then to engage the research community, for us, is very important. We want to make the data available as much as possible that we work with so people can poke at our assumptions and work with it. And so we're trying to work on ways that we can make it available in the RDC system to researchers who have access to it. And we've been in talks with Census Policy and them with IRS about how to make that work and to share our code as much as possible. We have one release from last February of 2023, and it really was a proof of concept of planting the flag of what we're doing. It was 1 year of data with sort of mirroring the income and poverty releases we do every year. So it's money income, and that means no taxes, credits, or in-kind benefits. But the goal was to sort of say, this is what we're doing, and this is how we're doing it. And this is what we're planning on, and then to get feedback as we move forward. And we have our paper and all the estimates available on the Census website. We have another release planned for the end of this calendar year. I don't know the date yet. We're finalizing things now. But there we're going to expand to taxes, credits, and in-kind transfers, the SPM, the supplemental poverty measures, to sort of try to get closer to being able to estimate any of the kinds of measures that people are interested in estimating from income data. And we've done a ton of work to improve our methods, to move towards better imputation algorithms, particularly faster ones, because timeliness is something that's very, very important to us. More flexible weighting algorithms, better ways of combining survey and administrative data, and to do everything faster. And so I want to talk a little bit now about some of the specific measurement challenges that we have to deal with and why this work is so hard and why we think it's so important. So I've already sort of mentioned the three main ones for surveys, which is not everybody answers the survey. And certainly since the pandemic, we've seen that that's biased our official income statistics up because it's been easier since the pandemic, including through this year, to reach higher income households than lower income households. Even when they answer the survey, people who are in the tails of the distribution are less likely to answer our income questions. That, again, for poverty, for example, biases our statistics up because we're not imputing them the low income that's partially correlated with their responses. But also, lots of people underreport their income, which biases our income statistics down because we're missing income that people have. And the key thing is these biases can have different signs and be very, very different in magnitude for different groups. But administrative data is not perfect either. It has very similar flavors of problems. So there's selection into administrative data. Not everybody has to file a 1040. If you're low income, you don't have to file. There's what I call administrative data non-response, which you could think of as like under the table pay. Lots of people have jobs. About 5% of working age adults have reported wage and salary earnings in the CPS ASEC and no corresponding W-2. There's what I call administrative data underreporting. So about half of all self-employment income in the national income and product accounts is imputed because audit studies have shown that people underreport their self-employment. And so it's about $600 or $700 billion a year. It's a lot of money. There's conceptual misalignment. Administrative data isn't always measuring exactly what we want it to from our perspective of measuring income. It's not meant for that. There's incomplete data coverage. So if you think of we get a lot of data from the states, but Census has to make agreements with every state for every data set. So we might have great SNAP data for one state, but not for another. And then there's selection into linkage where we might have the same person on the survey and we have their W-2, but we can't connect them to each other. And it's not random who we can link well and who we can't. And so we have to deal with all of these challenges to get the best possible estimate. I know this is totally illegible. The point is just to say we have different steps sort of building on our work and others' work to deal with these issues. So we have sort of weighting, which we do to address selection into our samples and selection into our data and linkage. We have a series of imputation steps to handle when we have data that's missing. And that's true both on the survey side and in the administrative data side. So we see, for example, millions of jobs that are only in one administrative earnings data set and millions that are only in others. And so once we've gone through our weighting and imputation steps, we've got what we think is a representative sample of the units we're interested in, the people we're interested in. We have complete data, conditional on the assumptions that we make in those. And we get to the estimation step, which is how do we put it together? So we have lots of measures of people's earnings. What is true earnings underlying it? And here's just to give you a sense for the weighting. Again, I know this is too small to read. The point is not that. The point is to show you how we sort of go through putting this data together. So we start here with all of the units that we randomly sample for the survey that are deemed occupied by field representatives and not vacant. We know a lot about where these units are, whether they answered the survey or not, and we can estimate, say, what is the racial breakdown and the education breakdown of the tracts and counties where units that responded and didn't respond were? What is the income in those places and how does that vary by response? We know a lot about the units themselves, even if they didn't respond, because we have information on them for the census's master address file. So say whether they're a single family home or a multi-unit apartment building. We have information on the value of those homes from Black Knight data. That's the kind of stuff you'd see on Zillow. And we can link those places to people that might live there, again, whether they responded or not, through, say, your W-2 has both information about you and your address. And then for those people we see at those places, we know a lot about them because we can link them to decennial censuses to get race information. We can link them to Social Security information to get benefits received. We can link them to their W-2s directly to see what their earnings were. And then for the people who have jobs, we can link those earnings to the firms that they worked at in the longitudinal business database to see how response varies by the kinds of earnings you have and the kinds of firms you work at to try to correct for selection into response. We do something very similar for the person level data with which we estimate income. And I have a similar chart in the paper. And then we get to the last stage, which is what do we do when we have all this data? So we have 5 separate sources of wage and salary earnings information. We have what they said on the survey. We have their W-2s. We have the detailed earnings records, which are the W-2 information that's been cleaned and processed by the Social Security Administration for the purposes of administering Social Security benefits later. We have the LEHD, which are firm reports of quarterly earnings to state unemployment insurance offices for the administration of the UI system. And then we have what you put on your 1040s. It's the case for every one of these that there are respondents or individual or households where there is income or earnings in only one and none of the others. And understanding why they disagree, when they disagree, and why they agree is super important for us to say, what do we think true earnings are from all of this data? Because we don't really have access to audit data to know what is true earnings when we see all of this information. And so I'm not going to go through this in a ton of detail, but it sort of involves steps of putting the administrative data together to get out what we think is the best possible estimate of your earnings from every job. Then how do we bring the survey? And when do we think the survey is providing information that, you got paid under the table, there's no W-2, when do we think the survey is accurate to get our final earnings estimate? And we have a model that we do that I don't have enough time to go into today about when do we pick the survey versus the ad rec, and in the next version, when are we going to take neither? And we think there's a third number that neither of them are accurate. But we use surveys in the first release for about 20% of households, and that's sort of partially coming off of some audit aggregate statistics that have been released in papers that SOI researchers have done to look at how often do W-2s and 1040 reports get adjusted at audit. And we basically run a model where we say, when do survey estimates of earnings for people like you, conditional on your observables, differ systematically from what the ad recs say? And we will lean on the surveys in those cases. And so that we didn't put in the industries or the occupations that we were going to use the surveys for. It came out that those differences are systematic for workers in certain occupations or industries like real estate and construction, and for younger workers where we think the survey might be picking up earnings that are not showing up in the administrative data, but less so for workers in, say, retail, education, management, healthcare, and less so for older workers. And that gets us to our estimates, which I've shown you already, but I do want to go beyond these sort of headline numbers to show you by age of household. So for money income, basically the entire story is income that's missing for those 55 and older, 65 and older. So we're missing very badly on the income of the 65 and over because their income is concentrated in sources that we do not measure well: interest, dividends, retirement income, and things like that. So we're missing by 20 to 30% across the distribution. We're getting poverty wrong by about a third for this group. There is not a statistically significant difference for any age group under 54, and that's because there are biases, but they're in opposite directions and they roughly cancel. So they underreport income some, but there's non-response bias, which shifts their income up some. And then the last thing I want to talk about is what we're doing now for the next release and our future plans. And one of the big things we kind of wanted to get, what is the best answer we could get sort of in 1 year? And there's sort of some Goldilocks years in which we have all the data we need, but they're kind of close to today. But how do we handle things as we move away from that? So if we want to do timely estimates, and I honestly think at Census we should think more timely than September of each year. Could we have an estimate out in May of 2027 for income in 2026? And to do that, that means that we're going to have incomplete data because the tax data doesn't exist, all of it at that point. A lot of high income filers don't even file until October. So it's not even that the data isn't at us yet. It's not even at the IRS yet. The data doesn't exist. And the same thing goes if we want to move back in time. We have W-2s right now back to 2005. If we want to go beyond that in time, we need to deal with the fact that data is going to be incomplete. And we also want to go to finer geographies. Right now, we've been focused on doing things right nationally, but how do we go back down to the state level and go even further than that? Because even if a county has 1,000 people, they might have 500 W-2s at that county. We know a lot about the income at the county. The ACS, as big as it is, might only have a handful of respondents in these small areas. And so that's sort of where we're headed and some of the challenges we're trying to address. And I'll leave you with the sort of, again, a link to our paper and an email address if you have comments or thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and I would like to invite all the speakers to go to the stage. We're going to do a quick rejoinder and some questions from the audience. Thanks again for the really, really interesting talks. So now I'm gonna first give Connie a chance to comment on the discussion discussants. Please, Connie.
Well, I think you can see when I gave kudos to this work, this is amazing work that is really both BEA and Census, and BLS is also doing great stuff, and the Fed. Amazing work that is really taking some of our key statistics to a new level of usefulness, accuracy, relevance. I resonate to Jonathan about timeliness is really, really important and very difficult. I also feel sad when I hear Marina talking about, and Jonathan would have stories too, about the difficulties of statistical agencies, let alone working with other agencies, but statistical agencies who all are under the CPS confidentiality protections and everything, but they still have problems sharing data, working together. And I would hope that in this area, as I'm sure it's true in other areas, that we could really try to up our game in that regard in the federal statistical system. The ASA report I referred to talks about the history of commissions and working groups that looked at federal statistical agencies, many of which recommended some consolidation. Well, this ASA report says we're not going there because the evidence is once you have turf established, and this is turf, you know, BLS, Department of Labor doesn't want to give up DLS, say to the Department of Commerce and so on and so on. We're just not going to get there. But that means that the system has to act virtually in a much more coordinated, coherent way. And the need in this particular area for this variety of data sources and modeling techniques and so on just underlines the need that the relevant agencies need to find hopefully laws may help too, or laws may need to be changed and can get changed, but ways to work more coherently and less friction together, because that is just essential. But I just want to thank the quality of this work is outstanding. And again, I am sure there are other areas of federal statistics where similar stories can be told and similar collaborative upping our game efforts would be important and should be pursued. So thank you both very much.
Okay, so I think I'd like to have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to ask you to please, if you have a questions, to go to the microphone. The microphone is over there. Please don't be shy. I know some of you have questions. Please. And you can line up if a lot of you have questions. And please state if the question is for someone in particular or for everyone.
It's for all. It's clear that different choices, policy choices in taxes and spending are going to have an impact on income. But my question really is, do different choices in taxes and spending affect the quality and the collectability of the data? So for example, I think we could observe that refundable tax credits greatly increase the motivation for lower income households to file. And on the other hand, lower tax rates would decrease their motivation to file if they don't owe anything. And therefore, we may be missing that important data source. So did that come up, or is it material, that kind of thing? Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to hear, Marina, would you like to respond first? This question's for everybody, so.
Since BEA doesn't collect data at the micro level, I'm going to actually pass it to Connie and John.
Well, but it does relate to your point that we need long time series in this particular subject matter. And so changes over time like that in tax and spending policies by the government, yeah, I would think could affect the aggregates as well as the micro data, just like changes in how statistical agencies treat their statistics. For instance, in CPS publications, income publications, there have been changes in top coding, not just in tables and PUMS files, but in the internal data, because apparently the assumption, oh, we're never going to see somebody at this level of income, right? And so that is a challenge when you're trying to backcast and have consistent series.
Yeah, I mean, we've thought about this a lot. So if you look at like the inequality numbers, a big part of the disagreement between these two research groups is how reporting changed around a tax law change in the 80s. And you see it again in 2008. There's a big push with a tax credit for a lot of zero income filers show up, and the same thing happens during the pandemic. And how to deal with that when you might have an artifact of that, if you're using the administrative data, affect your income estimates, when it might not actually be that anyone's income changed, that just whose income you see and don't see changes. It's a big challenge.
Okay, are there other questions? Could you please step to the microphone? Don't be shy. We got a couple minutes. I see someone moving, so.
Hi. Well, the focus has been on income. I wanted to get a little bit of your perspective. You both mentioned consumption as well as poverty as being one of the measures from a policy-driven aspect or the analysis. I wanted to gather your thoughts on potentially looking at wealth as basically a way of shifting potential consumption or income, especially for those that are during retirement or early on. Thank you.
Okay, so I take it this question is for everybody. Marina, would you care to answer this time? Or should I?
No, my answer won't be PE. It doesn't do well in this case. But no, we're working with the Fed, and we're going to try to integrate the wealth items from the SCF that we can into our joint distribution of income and consumption. This is a project that we have just started. It is, of course, difficult because there is no way to link the SCF with the CPS. In fact, the Fed doesn't even have, it's not that the Fed won't share that information, they don't even have the information on their respondents, like by contract, to be able to actually link it. So it's going to be an imputation-heavy exercise. And while I think wealth is really important, I think wealth is significantly harder to measure than income. I think there are assets that we can observe more readily than others, like homes, but even in that, you still end up with a question of how consumption is financed. And I think the bigger issue for most of the distribution is that debt is used to finance consumption more than stores of assets. So of course you could say, yes, at the top, there's going to be more assets financing consumption, but you would be surprised at even how much debt is used at the top to finance consumption rather than drawing down on those assets. So we're definitely in the process of doing some research on it, but I think given what I said about the difficulties of assumptions and their impacts on the distribution, I would be a little hesitant to, take the results too seriously in terms of small changes. We're hoping to get a ballpark idea, basically.
Yes, it is certainly the case. When I talked about at the turn of the 20th century, Gilded Age and robber barons, we are in a similar age today. We have these, multi-billionaire, almost trillionaire folks out there and so on. And wealth clearly is really, really important. And families that have wealth that they can pass down to kids and grandkids are just way ahead of families that don't. And of course, we have from history some very uneven distribution of wealth and even home ownership in that regard. The report I referred to on an integrated system of income, consumption, and wealth statistics would, again, want to have movement on all three fronts. But I personally agree with Marina. Wealth is really difficult, and it is, again, the Survey of Consumer Finance has an upper income sample from IRS records, which they cannot share with anybody else. So you, again, you have to do it on an imputation basis. And income is still, I think, remains pretty important about what people have available, because we are a spending, consumer spending economy that depends on the consumer out there spending. And so, yes, challenging, but I'm glad to hear of this work.
I mean, the other thing I would add is that part of the focus on income is it's much easier to validate income against administrative data. We have much more administrative data that we collect on income versus consumption and wealth, and it's much harder then to know how much we might be missing for those other categories. But it's super important. I mean, if you think of any income shock, what does it mean to your well-being? Well, that's a function of how much wealth you have or ability to draw on debt to smooth across those shocks.
In fact, in terms of tax policy, we have an income tax. We actually had one during the Civil War, and then there had to be some court cases in the Supreme Court and so on. And then 1913, we do, and we have, of course, local sales taxes and property taxes and so on. But we do not have value-added taxes, nationwide consumption taxes. And if we did, that would change some of this picture, presumably, of what data were available and so on. So Jonathan, I think, is right that with the current and longstanding tax system, we have a lot more information available on income than the other two.
And I'll add one more thing, which is I mentioned homes, which seems like a relatively straightforward asset to value. It's certainly the asset that dominates the majority of portfolios of households in the United States. However, with some of my research, I looked at actual sales and then questions in the census about what people think their home is worth. And the case during about 2007 to 2016, which is the period I was able to look at, showed that people were off by something like 30% on their home values during the crash, especially in states in the Southwest where they were hit some of the hardest in the crash. And so that gets to your question of, other than the very, very top where a lot of the assets are likely hidden anyway, if we're looking at wealth for the rest of the distribution and we can't get their most salient, easily measurable asset right during periods of turmoil, what does that say about our ability to get the rest of it right is a question I have.
Some really good points, very interesting. But unfortunately, the time has come. We need to walk towards the reception. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, because we can continue this fascinating discussion in the reception. So you won't get lost, because if you go outside and turn right, there will be people to direct you to the patio. But before you go, one more round of applause for our speakers, please. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for coming, and we'll see you at the reception.